It was past midnight, the kind of hour when the city seems to breathe differently. The rain had stopped, leaving dark puddles that reflected the city's neon lights. A quiet unease blanketed the streets as a lone bus rolled through the sleeping city, its engine humming steadily. On board, a weary man stepped inside, searching for nothing more than a sliver of peace after an exhausting day. But what he found that night would haunt him forever. This is Eerie Road Tales, where we recount the stories that linger in the shadows of reality. Tonight, we bring you the creepiest bus ride ever, the haunting tale of Passenger 98. A story that begins with a whisper and ends in an unforgettable silence. David, a mid-level office employee in his 30s, had long since grown accustomed to stressful days. But this day was different. It had stretched his patience and energy to the breaking point. His boss had heaped an impossible number of deadlines onto his desk just hours before they were due, all while demanding updates every hour. Calls from clients came one after the other, each angrier and more impatient than the last. His co-workers, too busy with their own tasks, offered little more than brief, polite smiles, empty gestures that did nothing to alleviate the mounting pressure. By the time he finally clocked out, it felt as though the weight of the entire day had been piled onto his shoulders. The office building's fluorescent lights felt harsh against his tired eyes as he trudged out into the cold, rainy night. The rain had soaked the city thoroughly, and the streets reflected the glow of neon signs and streetlights, creating an almost surreal scene. Cars passed by, their tires splashing through puddles, the occasional honk breaking the stillness. David pulled his jacket tighter around himself, his breath visible in the chilly air. He sighed heavily, his mind already yearning for the quiet solitude of his small apartment, a space where he could escape the noise and demands of the world, even if just for a few hours. The bus stop stood under the faint light of a flickering street lamp. David approached it slowly, his shoes splashing slightly in shallow puddles. He glanced around. The street was eerily empty. Normally, there would be at least a few others waiting alongside him, but tonight he stood alone. He shoved his hands into his pockets, rocking slightly on his heels as he waited. The sound of distant traffic and the soft patter of rain against metal poles filled the air. Time seemed to stretch as he stood there, his mind replaying the events of the day like a broken record. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away, focusing instead on the faint rumble of an approaching engine. When the bus finally pulled into view, its headlights pierced through the fog like twin beacons. It came to a halt with a low hiss, the hydraulics groaning slightly as the doors opened. David felt a small wave of relief wash over him. Just seeing the familiar sight of the bus offered a sense of routine, of normalcy. He climbed aboard, nodding briefly at the driver, who barely looked up. The man's eyes were heavy-lidded, his face lined with years of working long, unforgiving shifts. David swiped his card, the electronic beep sounding louder than usual in the stillness of the bus. The interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights casting a pale, uneven glow over the seats. The air inside was warm but slightly stale, carrying the faint scent of damp clothing and worn upholstery. David's eyes quickly scanned the bus. It wasn't empty, but it wasn't crowded either. In the far back, a young couple sat huddled together, their faces illuminated by the cold, bluish light of their phones. They were utterly absorbed in their screens, their fingers occasionally swiping or tapping, as if they were in their own world. In the middle of the bus sat an older woman, alone. She wore a worn gray overcoat, the fabric slightly frayed at the edges. A knitted shawl was draped over her shoulders, its faded colors hinting at years of use. Her small hat, perched neatly atop her head, looked like something out of a bygone era. It was the kind of accessory that might have been fashionable decades ago but now felt out of place. She didn't look up as David walked past her. Her posture was rigid, her back straight against the seat. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her thin fingers clasped tightly together as if holding onto something invisible. Her head was slightly bowed, her face obscured by the shadow of her hat. She gave no indication that she had even noticed David's presence. David lingered for a moment, his gaze briefly settling on her before he moved to a seat a few rows ahead on the opposite side of the bus. There was something about her that caught his attention, something he couldn't quite place. But he shook it off. He was too tired to think about it. He settled into his seat with a weary sigh, leaning back against the hard plastic. He closed his eyes, letting the rhythmic hum of the engine wash over him. The bus jerked slightly as it pulled away from the curb, the rain-soaked streets outside blurring into streaks of light and shadow. For a brief moment, David felt himself begin to relax. The weight of the day seemed to ease, replaced by the comforting monotony of the bus's motion. He didn't know it yet, but the peace he was seeking would soon be shattered. The quiet he longed for wouldn't last. At first, it was just a faint noise, so quiet that it barely registered over the sound of the engine. David dismissed it, assuming it was just part of the usual hum of the bus, or perhaps even his own mind playing tricks on him after a long day. But as the minutes dragged on, the noise became more defined, sharper, more intrusive. It was a voice, soft, steady, and unchanging. David's eyes opened slowly. He sat still, trying to place the source of the sound. The voice came from behind him, barely rising above a whisper, yet carrying with an unnatural clarity. He tilted his head, focusing. The words weren't words at all. They were numbers. 98, 98, 98. It wasn't loud, but it sliced through the bus's low rumble like a persistent drip of water in an empty room. David frowned, shifting in his seat as unease settled over him. The sound was repetitive, mechanical, like a clock that refused to tick forward. He glanced around the bus, scanning the other passengers. The couple at the back remained hunched over their phones, completely absorbed in their screens, oblivious to the voice. The driver stared straight ahead, his tired face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. No one else seemed to notice. David's gaze fell on the old woman sitting a few rows behind him. She hadn't moved since he'd boarded, her posture straight, her head slightly tilted down. Her hands were clasped neatly in her lap, her fingers thin and pale. Her lips moved ever so slightly. 98, 98, 98. David tried to convince himself it was harmless. Just an old woman lost in her thoughts, he reasoned. Maybe she was counting something. Beads on a rosary? Steps she'd taken? But she wasn't holding anything in her hands, just clasping them together tightly, as if guarding some unseen object. He turned away, leaning back into his seat and closing his eyes again. He tried to drown it out, focusing on the rhythmic vibrations of the bus as it rattled over uneven roads. But the number lingered in his head. 98, 98, 98. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was becoming a presence, worming its way into his thoughts like an unwelcome guest. David shifted again, more agitated this time. He pressed his hands against his knees, tapping his fingers nervously. He told himself to let it go. It was just a harmless muttering, nothing more. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, the repetition became unbearable. He turned his head slightly, stealing another glance at the old woman. Her position hadn't changed. She sat perfectly still, her lips moving at the same measured pace, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. 98, 98, 98. The monotony of it was maddening. David looked toward the couple at the back again, wondering how they could remain so indifferent. Couldn't they hear it? Didn't it bother them? He shifted his attention to the driver. Surely, he must be able to hear the voice. But the driver remained motionless, his hands gripping the wheel as the bus glided through the rain-soaked streets. The number kept coming, each utterance carving its way deeper into David's mind. He sat upright, staring ahead, his pulse quickening. Why that number? Why was she repeating it? David's chest tightened as his frustration began to boil over. He could feel the tension creeping up his neck, the muscles in his jaw clenching. For several more minutes, he tried to ignore it, willing himself to focus on something, anything else. He thought about work, about the projects waiting for him tomorrow, about the cup of coffee he'd make when he got home. But no matter what he thought of, the voice was there, cutting through his attempts like a knife through fog. 98, 98, 98. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was invading his thoughts, seeping into the cracks of his mind. David could feel his patience unraveling, thread by thread. He couldn't take it anymore. David turned fully in his seat, unable to contain his frustration any longer. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tight but controlled, laced with a tension that betrayed his growing irritation. "Could you stop that?" The old woman didn't respond. Her head remained bowed, her hands still neatly folded in her lap. She didn't even acknowledge his presence. Her chant continued, steady and unbroken, as though he weren't even there. 98, 98, 98. David's jaw clenched as he watched her, his patience wearing thin. His fingers curled into fists, the pressure making his knuckles ache. He cleared his throat loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the bus. It was sharp, deliberate, a sound that demanded attention. But she didn't flinch. Her lips moved with the same slow, deliberate rhythm, her voice soft but persistent. The bus hit a pothole, jolting David slightly forward in his seat. Overhead, one of the fluorescent lights flickered, casting brief shadows that danced across the old woman's face. She was still, her chant unbroken, as though the world around her didn't exist. "Why are you saying that?" David demanded, his voice rising with each word. He leaned forward, gripping the back of his seat for support as he faced her. "What does it mean?" Her hands remained folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. She didn't look at him, didn't react. The words came like clockwork, measured and unwavering. 98, 98, 98. David's stomach churned, unease now mixing with his anger. The repetition wasn't just annoying, it felt wrong. There was something unsettling about the way she said it, as if the number carried a weight he couldn't understand. He looked around the bus, hoping someone else might step in. Surely someone had to notice this, had to feel the same discomfort gnawing at him. The couple at the back glanced up, their expressions blank, almost annoyed by the interruption. One of them gave a small shrug before returning to their phone, the faint tapping of the screen punctuating the old woman's chant. The driver stared straight ahead, his face bathed in the faint glow of the dashboard. His hands gripped the wheel firmly, his focus unshaken. David turned back to the woman, his frustration boiling over. He slammed his hand against the metal rail beside his seat, the sound ringing through the bus like a warning shot. "Stop it!" he snapped, his voice louder now, the sharpness of it cutting through the stale air. "I'm talking to you." The old woman's chant continued, uninterrupted, as though his outburst hadn't even registered. 98, 98, 98, 98. David's pulse quickened, his breathing shallow. His chest tightened with a mixture of anger and fear, the two emotions twisting together in a way that left him feeling both helpless and enraged. The words weren't just sounds anymore. They were in his head now, looping over and over, burrowing deep. "Why won't you stop?" he said again, his voice trembling. He leaned further into the aisle, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "What are you trying to say?" For a brief moment, he thought he saw her head tilt slightly, her lips pausing mid-word. But just as quickly, she resumed, her voice as steady as ever. 98, 98, 98. David leaned back in his seat, pressing his hands against his temples as he tried to collect himself. His mind raced, searching for some kind of explanation. Was she mentally ill? Lost in thought? Or was it something else? Something more sinister? The bus swayed gently as it turned another corner, the streetlights outside casting fleeting streaks of light through the windows. David stared ahead, trying to focus on anything other than the sound that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. But it was impossible to ignore. The repetition wasn't just noise anymore. It was a presence, a constant that seemed to press against his chest, filling the space around him. It was inescapable, suffocating. "Madam," he said again, his tone sharper, more insistent. "I'm asking you to stop." For the first time, her head tilted slightly, just enough for the brim of her hat to shift. David leaned forward, his breath caught in his throat. He thought she might finally respond, might finally acknowledge him. But her lips moved again. 98, 98, 98. David felt a shiver run down his spine. The air around him felt heavier now, thicker, as though the temperature had dropped. He glanced toward the driver again, willing him to notice, to say something, to break the spell that seemed to have fallen over the bus. But the driver remained silent, his focus unwavering. David's frustration turned to desperation. He turned back to the old woman one last time, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his words barely above a whisper. "Why won't you stop?" The old woman didn't respond. Her chant continued, steady, deliberate, and unyielding. 98, 98, 98, 98, 98. David leaned back in his seat, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the armrests. His heart was pounding now, his breathing shallow. The bus jolted again as it hit another pothole, the light above flickering briefly before steadying. David's eyes darted around the bus, searching for some kind of escape from the relentless repetition. He couldn't take it anymore. When the bus finally slowed at the next stop, David stood abruptly. His fingers gripped the cold metal of the overhead rail tightly, his knuckles white. The hiss of the hydraulic doors opening was a welcome sound, promising relief from the maddening repetition that had burrowed into his mind. He didn't care that he wasn't near his destination anymore. He needed to leave. As he stepped onto the curb, a cool gust of night air brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of wet asphalt. For a moment, he felt a flicker of relief. The constant muttering that had haunted him for the last half hour was finally behind him. But something inside him refused to let go. The number 98 still echoed in his head, refusing to fade even with the growing distance from the bus. It wasn't just the sound, it was the complete lack of explanation, the absence of meaning. It clawed at him, demanding answers. "Why?" he shouted, his voice breaking the stillness of the night. He took a step closer to the bus, his heart pounding. "Why 98? What does it mean?" His voice was loud enough to echo slightly off the nearby buildings, But inside the bus, there was no reaction. The couple in the back didn't look up. The driver didn't turn his head. And the old woman didn't move. The silence that followed was deafening. It pressed against him, heavier than the sound of her voice had been. For a fleeting moment, David felt a flicker of triumph, a strange satisfaction that he had managed to break through her relentless murmuring. And then it happened. The blare of a horn shattered the silence, a sharp, frantic sound that froze David in his tracks. He turned his head just in time to see the blinding glare of headlights barreling toward him. He had no time to react. The impact was swift and brutal, the car's momentum sending David's body flying backward onto the cold, wet pavement. The sound of screeching tires echoed through the empty street, followed by the panicked shouts of the driver as the vehicle came to an abrupt halt. Inside the bus, the atmosphere remained eerily calm. The old woman's lips began to move again. Slowly, deliberately, she resumed her chant. But this time, the number had changed. 99, 99, 99. Her voice was soft, steady, and unwavering, just as it had been before. She adjusted the shawl around her shoulders, straightened her hat, and sat back, her hands clasped in her lap once more. The driver, oblivious to what had happened outside, focused on the road ahead. The couple at the back remained engrossed in their phones, their screens glowing faintly in the dim light. The bus pulled away from the curb, its engine humming softly as it disappeared down the quiet street. David's lifeless body lay under the flickering streetlight, his face pale and still. A small crowd began to gather, their voices hushed as they took in the horrific scene. A passerby reached for their phone to call emergency services, their trembling fingers struggling to dial. But on that bus, no one looked back. The old woman's chant continued, soft but steady, fading into the distance as the bus carried her to her next destination. What do you think her chant meant? Was it a coincidence, or was there something more to it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, be sure to like this video, share it with others who love stories that leave you questioning reality, and subscribe to Eerie Road Tales for more unsettling journeys into the unknown. Until next time, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes the things that seem most ordinary hide the greatest mysteries.